Chapter 23 Burn. There was seldom any peace anymore. In the days since returning from Equestria, the world had grown harsher and colder. Day by day, things only seemed more and more bleak, and Sunset was left wondering why she bothered at all. Every day was spent going through the motions. Sunset just did what she always did, only because she always did it. She didn't even remember what happened. She had been talking with her replacement, then she heard Celestia's voice. The next thing she knew, she was lying on her back at New Horizons while staring at the ceiling. It was only later that she learned there was a 3-day gap between the two events. And there was the vibrating. Everywhere she went, it followed her, no longer confined to the book, a constant echoing reminder of the world that had abandoned her, a fake promise that someone was reaching out for her. It would only stop long enough for her to get used to the silence before catching her unaware. There were other things. Despite her caution to avoid them, sometimes she would be caught off guard by a mirror. It was the last class of the day, and the girl who sat in front of her was using a pocket mirror to fix her makeup. Sunset hadn't expected it, so she hadn't avoided it, and once she noticed, it was impossible to look away. The mirror reflected the surroundings perfectly. Nothing was there that shouldn't be, for a change. It just showed the girl applying her lipstick in Sunset's desk position behind her. And that was all. Where Sunset herself should have been, there was just the chair she was sitting in, empty. The lack of her reflection captivated her, and she didn't even realize that she was staring. Eventually, the other girl noticed. She turned around and cheerfully asked if Sunset needed her for something. Sunset said something as well, but she couldn't remember what it was afterwards. Whatever she'd said caused the other girl to stop looking so cheerful and turn back around now. The rest of class passed by. The teacher continued talking about something, the upcoming exam or something like that. It was hard to tell. Sunset only heard some of his words. Other students seemed to be busy taking notes. Sunset wondered if she should as well, until she realized she already was. She looked down at what she had written. I don't need me anymore. Equestria doesn't need me anymore. I thought I was going home. I don't have a home. I don't deserve a home. I have nothing. I am nothing. I will only ever be nothing. I don't need me anymore. Sunset kept writing her notes. A tone sounded over the intercom, alerting everyone that afternoon announcements would be made. Vice Principal Luna always ended the day. There was another voice that Sunset heard. Sunset Shimmer, Celestia said over the intercom. Sunset already knew which Celestia it was. Do not think you belong in this world any more than you belong in mine. You could never belong anywhere. No one would ever want you. Sunset nodded along. She knew it was true. I wish I could be rid of you as well. I've already found some pony who surpasses you in every way, after all. But you are my responsibility, and I will fulfill my obligations. Come to the school's auditorium. I will be waiting for you. The intercom cut out, and students started getting out of their seats. The teacher said something as they left the room. Most of the students were out the door by the time Sunset put away her stuff. As she tucked her notes in her backpack, she noticed a flower on the floor. She picked that up as well. It was a wispy, crimson-colored flower with a thin stamen extending out of it. Sunset recognized it immediately. It was her favorite. When she stood up, there was another. Past that, another. Without concerning herself with the rest of the students, Sunset followed the trail of Lycoris out of the hall. They continued in a path, which Sunset continued to follow. Lycoris radiata were beautiful, but that was only part of their allure. They were used by humans for various purposes, but they were also highly poisonous if consumed. Because of this, they were regarded as the flowers of death. Sunset followed them readily. They grew thicker as she went, until the whole hallway was a blood-red river of flowers. Still, Sunset followed. They led her outside, where they were in bloom all over the school courtyard. They were no longer what Sunset's concern was, however. There was a purple unicorn sitting at the base of the statue. She was looking around her, searching for something. Once she noticed Sunset walking forward, her smile confirmed what it was. "Hello, Sunset," she said cheerfully. "Princess Celestia told me all about you, and I just knew I had to come see you for myself. You really should have introduced yourself better, you know. We have so much to talk about." Sunset just stared down at the little pony. She was smaller than a human or a horse, only coming up to Sunset's waist. "I think it's best if we get the important part out of the way first." The unicorn beamed up at her. "Stay the hell away from Princess Celestia. She's mine now, and doing much better without you around to fuck everything up." Sunset kneeled down to be on level with the pony. "Now then, as long as we understand that, I think we're going to be the best of friends. Princess Celestia told me you weren't very good with friends, but that's okay. I'm sure if you follow my example, we'll do just—" Sunset wrapped her hands around Twilight's neck. She pushed the unicorn onto her back and held down, squeezing as hard as she could. It was easy. Twilight tried to pull Sunset's arms off her, but her hoofs couldn't grab like hands could, and Sunset was far bigger. It was easy and so fucking satisfying. Little by little, the movement slowed while Twilight gasped for breath. There was no magic outside of Equestria, and no one to save her. Sunset smiled when she finally stopped moving. It was the first time she'd smiled since coming back through the portal. And then it was over. Twilight's sparkle was dead, and she couldn't outshine Sunset anymore. When Sunset moved her hands, there was red all over them. It covered Twilight's coat, staining that perfect lavender. But it wasn't blood. It was much better than that. Sunset and Twilight were both covered in flower petals. Sunset was still holding one in her hand. Lycoris radiata were beautiful, but that was only part of the allure. Sunset lifted the bulb and placed it in her mouth. The vibration started again, and Sunset realized there was a hand on her shoulder. She blinked and came to her senses. She was in the courtyard, but the flowers were gone. There was no dead pony. She wasn't even on the ground. She was standing in front of the statue, looking into its reflective surface. The reflection staring back at her was her own, and it was not. She had dark red skin and bat-like wings. Her hair and dress were flames, and her eyes were black and green. She saw a demon in the mirror, staring back at her. She saw fire given solid form. There was a voice. Sunset turned to see Flash. He was smiling. He was talking to her. What was he saying? Something about knowing he'd find her here? Sunset said something as well. He wanted her to go to the auditorium. She followed him without questioning it. Along the way, he smiled and held out his hand. Sunset took it. She had grown accustomed to the contact, and it no longer made her uncomfortable. So instead, she let go of his hand and wrapped her arm around his back. He followed suit and placed an arm around his shoulder, and all the while he was talking. That was better. The closer she was to him, the less at ease she felt. Holding hands was no longer good enough, and even walking side by side in a half-embrace hardly did anything. Still, it made her feel a little uneasy, and that was good. It was a real kind of discomfort, something she could understand, something that could distract her from whatever else there was around her. She tried to focus on that, but it too was becoming more normalized. They walked into the auditorium together, but they had to part ways. Sunset didn't know why, but she knew they did. Flash was going to sit in the crowd, while Sunset went backstage. There was a reason, she was sure, but she just couldn't remember it. Flash gave her a smile and a thumbs up while walking away, but Sunset was already moving on. He had served his purpose by distracting her, but he couldn't do that any longer. Backstage, Sunset found herself being corralled by Vice Principal Luna. She was addressing several students at once, Sunset among them. Apparently she was proud of them, but Sunset still wasn't sure why. One by one, students went out to the stage. Principal Celestia was out there, and she addressed every student as they came. The same motions for every one of them. The student walked onto the stage, Celestia said something, the audience cheered, and Luna sent out the next student. The students were sent out in order of grade level, with the older students going first. By the time Sunset's turn came, 3/4 of the students had gone. She was the first freshman to be sent out, however, which she was sure bore some significance. When Sunset walked out, she saw the entire school was ahead of her. She had never gone before so many before, but she thought little of it. She walked to the front, taking her place beside Celestia. Celestia turned and smiled at her. They didn't have the same smile, not quite, which made it easier. How did Sunset ever mistake this poor imitation for the real princess? Celestia presented Sunset with a plaque. It was simple. Canterlot High School's logo engraved in a gold-colored metal. There were words on it, stating her name and that it was the Bright Future Award. Sunset taking the award was Celestia's cue. She launched into a small speech about how proud she was, and that Sunset was sure to go far in life. Sunset wasn't listening. She had another Celestia's words on her mind. Never lose your fire, my gifted student. Sunset looked over the crowd. They were clapping politely as Celestia finished her speech. Sunset looked over them and realized that it wasn't enough. She could get more. She would get more. These students only needed the right push, and they'd all bow to her. They'd adore her far more than they adored Celestia. Or, if Sunset chose, they'd fear her. Many students at Everfree Middle School had feared her, but it had never been enough. She could see that now. These students would know her. Sunset was done hiding in the shadows, and if they wouldn't love her, they would fear her. But just as soon as it had started, it was over. Sunset knew what she was supposed to do, even if she couldn't remember being told, and she did it. She marched along to where the other award-winning students were waiting, and Celestia announced the next recipient. Sunset was certain that the applause was quieter than it had been for her. The vibrating got worse while the others finished, until Sunset began to worry that someone else might hear it. How could they not? It was all around them, but nobody reacted to it, so neither did Sunset. She had to complete the motions. She wasted no time once the ceremonies were over. There was nowhere she had to go, but she had to go somewhere. She had to escape that awful vibrating. It called to her. It wanted to deceive her. She wasn't aware of anything else. There was the vibrating and nothing else. It was deafening and made her whole body ache. That was why it took her so long to notice. There was another vibrating, but this one was in her pocket. It pulled Sunset back out of her fog, and she realized that she was outside the school, sitting in the grass. She was off to the side of the building, where she couldn't see the statue. Sunset pulled out her phone, a purchase she had made with her new income. There were new text messages from Flash asking where she was. They were supposed to meet up after the ceremony, it seemed. Sunset answered him, then put her phone away. She covered her head with her arms. The vibrating had dulled, but was still present. At least there were no other students in the immediate vicinity, but she still saw them out and about. They all seemed so happy, but Sunset couldn't understand why. When Flash found her, he looked annoyed. He was trying to say something about her running off without him, but she cut him off by throwing her arms around him and resting her head on his chest. Sunset wasn't sure what he said, but his voice had grown concerned. It helped. Especially when Flash followed her lead and put his arms around her as well, it helped. But Sunset had grown too used to his physical affection, and it was no longer enough to keep her fully distracted. She would have to push for more. Sunset looked at him and couldn't place his expression. It didn't really matter. She closed her eyes and brought her lips to his. It wasn't like they had never kissed before. They had been dating for months, after all. But usually, Sunset reserved kisses for parting ways, and they had generally kept them short. This was unlike that. This was unlike that. Sunset needed something to hold on to, something that would pull her back into reality. And if the only thing she had was her discomfort, then she would take that. Sunset pushed Flash against the wall, covering his body with hers. As they kissed, Sunset felt more aware of her surroundings than she had all day. She even began to realize that she had no idea what she was doing, and if Flash were more experienced, he'd probably find her attempts at making out ridiculous. "What brought that on?" Flash asked as they pulled apart. "Are you complaining?" Sunset heard herself answer. It was the first focused exchange she'd had all day, and one of the only since she'd returned from Equestria. It seemed having a lovesick boyfriend could still prove a useful distraction, and Sunset relished the fact that the only noise came from the other students around them. No, not at all, Flash said with a smirk. I was just wondering so I could know how to do it again. Sunset grinned. Well, school's almost out, and I think we'll have a lot more time to spend together over the summer. I won't complain about that. Flash motioned towards the back of the school where the buses were, or rather, where they should have been. You've been out here a long time. The bus left already. Sunset stared at the lot, empty of all but a few lingering students. Yeah, I guess it did. Come on, let's head to my house. Flash held out his hand for Sunset's. Reasoning that she couldn't refuse him something so simple after what had just happened, Sunset took his hand again as they walked off. Hey, Flash's tone shifted back to concern. Is everything alright? You've been distant lately. Sunset frowned. There was no good way that conversation could go. I don't know. It's been a shitty week. She looked back at him and put on a reassuring smile. But I think things are looking up now. Flash smiled as well, so hopeful for a positive answer that it seemed he wasn't even going to question it. All right, but you know I'm always here if you need me. I know. Sunset didn't doubt that, nor did she doubt that she would be needing him again. Things were okay now, but she knew that wouldn't last. There was a serious risk that she'd be back to being a zombie before the day was out. Meanwhile, everyone around her continued as if things were fine. Better than fine. Everyone around her seemed so damn happy. Sunset couldn't understand it. Sunset had gone to another world. She now knew beyond a doubt that she wasn't a human, that she didn't belong in this place. There was someone else taking up the spot that was rightfully her own, and nothing was the way it should be. She had distracted herself from negative thoughts before going through the portal by keeping busy, but that was no longer good enough, so she knew it was time to push for more. While they walked through the school courtyard, Sunset took a look at the surrounding students. She had learned a lot during her first year at CHS. She knew how they worked. Everyone fell into their own cliques, but they intermingled easily. It would be easy to change that, though. They just needed the right push. Sunset could unite them closer than ever, or she could divide them once and for all. Either way, she'd place herself on top. It might not be easy, but she had the time to do it. The portal was closed, and it wouldn't open again until her senior year. The only question that remained was what kind of ruler Sunset would be. 5 people caught her attention. It would have been hard to miss them with all the noise Rainbow Dash was making. She was cheering about the end of the school year, with Pinkie Pie joining in the premature celebration. Ever the voice of reason, Rarity was reminding them that they still had finals over the next few days. Meanwhile, Fluttershy and Applejack were just laughing at their antics. They all looked so happy, as if just being around each other was the best thing in the world. And then Applejack saw Sunset, and she smiled and waved. It was that perfect smile, the one Sunset had in her head for years, the one she hadn't quite shown since they started at CHS. But Sunset knew it wasn't for her. That smile was reserved for Applejack's real friends. And Sunset knew there was no question about it. She was going to rule the school, and she was going to do it her way. Everyone was just so fucking happy. Everyone except Sunset. She watched as Applejack turned back to her friends and said something that made everyone else laugh. And Sunset knew right then that if she was going to divide the school, there was only one place to start. Sunset wouldn't lose her fire. She couldn't. She would find her way to the top, and everyone would know to fear her name. There was no other way. Sunset Shimmer was fire given solid form, and it was time for everyone else to burn. End Act 3.